Welcome back, Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor. Really pleased to have Alasdair Macleod with us again. He is a senior fellow at the Gold Money Foundation and head of research at Gold Money. And you can and should read Alasdair's Gold Money Insights letter every Thursday at goldmoney.com. So on the research page there, it's certainly one of those things that I have to see every week to keep up with what Alasdair is talking about and what's going on in the gold markets. From a fundamental point of view. And so today I want to have Alasdair discuss a couple very important recent letters that came out that he wrote. The March 31 was titled Edging Towards a Gold Standard, and April 7th, The Commodity Currency Revolution. So Alasdair, thank you so much for joining me again.
That's my pleasure, Jay.
You know, I don't know what you are hearing in Great Britain, but when I turn on the news here in the United States, I hear all about how the United States can and must win the war in Ukraine, and that we're about, that we need to keep sending more and more weapons to the Ukraine to drive Putin's military out of the country, and try Putin for war crimes. I hear about how effective sanctions are, but we're told that it's just a matter of time before the sanctions we've placed on Putin is going to make him cry uncle and submit to us. Never is there any discussion about the possibility that sanctions might be counterproductive. Are you hearing more or less the same sort of meme in the UK?
Well, similar, I think, is the answer, Jay. It's always very difficult to know. I mean, the one casualty in war is truth. We just we know that it's horrid, and it's particularly horrid because, for Brits, I mean, we live on an island. We haven't had this, sort of armies marching through our territory and killing people on the way through. I mean, this is basically what Europe has had for the last 2,000 years. It just happens periodically. I'm not excusing it. I'm just saying that this is, for the first time with media and all the rest of it, we're really having our noses rubbed in it. And it's not nice. It really isn't. Now, having said that, I was interested in 2 points you made. One is that, sort of talking about the US has got to win the war in Ukraine. Now, hold on a minute. We're not, the US and NATO are not at war in Ukraine. I mean, if that was the case, it would be World War III. So I think your media is probably going a little over the top on that. With respect to sanctions, I think this is a very important point because the fact of the matter is that the Russian economy is basically quite strong. It is bedeviled by a very volatile currency, which is made volatile and particularly volatile by actions from the US, and I think that was part of the purpose of sanctions, to undermine the currency and through that make life extremely difficult for Putin. But actually, what's happened is that the currency has recovered back to more or less where it was before this started. I mean, I've got it at 81 rubles. It's been down to 75 rubles. I mean, that's up again. That's up for the ruble rather than for the dollar. Yeah. Let's try and talk some truth about these sanctions, because that really is the real issue. I mean, America is preaching about sanctions from another continent, and it's not really directly affected. The EU is very directly affected, and if she has to pay a lot more for energy, if she has to do without energy, basically the EU economy is in dire straits. I mean, it really is. It is as simple as that. Now, what Putin has quite cleverly done, and I hate to say this of Putin, but he is clever, let's give him that, is that he has effectively said to the EU, well, you go along with the with the Americans if you want, in which case you're going to have to go and fish for oil and natural gas, and you will have to pay an open market price. On the other hand, if you're prepared to cooperate with us, then we will sell you gas and oil at reasonable prices, but you will have to pay in rubles. So what do you want? Do you want to pay a reasonable price in rubles, or do you want to pay through the nose and not get the necessary natural gas and oil by going into the open markets? Mm-hmm. So, this is the point about these sanctions. These sanctions actually are blowing back on America's partners very, very badly. And not only that, but if you look at the food situation, Ukraine is known as the breadbasket of Europe, and that is for very good reason, because it is a major, major wheat producer. And not only that, but the Russian steppes, adjoining Ukraine, also is a huge producer and exporter of grains. And not only that, but they produce and export fertilizer as well. Mm-hmm. So what we have is a situation where the world is going to be short of grains and short of fertilizer to keep production up in the summer months. I mean, we are facing a real food crisis in the middle of this year. Mm-hmm. And, thanks a bunch for these sanctions. I mean, because that is actually all they're achieving. It is blowing back on the West and also on countries in Africa and countries like Egypt, who are great importers of wheat and maize. I mean, the effect of this is actually disastrous. We're going to have very serious famines later on this year in the poor nations. And so what do? We stand back and say, well, collateral damage. Now, come on. This is actually a very, very serious issue. And it does not behove the President of the United States really to stand up and say, well, we're gonna lick this guy. We've got to stop the Russians, and in the process, basically, get people starving. I'm sorry, but this is actually a very serious matter. I'm not saying that there was necessarily much of an alternative, but it could have been a bit better planned.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly, you have to wonder. I mean, it's certainly not just a Western European problem. Food prices are rising around the world already. That might not just be related to the Ukrainian situation, but other things that, we've talked about before on this show, massive amounts of money creation out of the central banks around the world without the same amount of supply. But Peru is having food riots, I understand, right now. The poorer countries, as you say. But the Europeans, I mean, how far can they take this? And politically, why not buy gas from Russia? What's so dangerous about that? Are the Europeans really fearful that Russia is going to take back? I mean, part of the rhetoric we're hearing here is that Putin won't just stop with the Ukraine. He'll go into Poland. He'll start taking back all of the satellite countries of the old Soviet Union. Do you think that's a legitimate fear? Do you think Europeans are fearful of that? Some are, I'm sure.
Well, I think, yes, that is right. I mean, put yourself in the position of the Baltic states. You escape the Soviet Union to find that, Soviet Union Mark II is marching into Ukraine and, beating the drum against NATO. You may be a member of NATO, but if you weren't a member of NATO, you would think, my goodness, perhaps we would be next. No, there is a lot of genuine fear about what happens after Ukraine. But the problem I think that the EU has is that left to their own devices, the EU would actually go and buy Russian gas. And I think that's probably what they'll end up doing because they really have no alternative. The problem really is that they don't want to upset the Americans. You've got a NATO alliance which has, if you like, kept Europe secure since the Second World War. And, this is not something you toss over easily. And there is no doubt that the Americans, supported by the British, have lent very, very hard on the Germans in particular, who, remember, had Nord Stream 2 and, very much involved with the Russians. I mean, one of the other problems is that the EU has been pursuing a green agenda, which... in the case of Germany, has even gone to the extent of closing down nuclear power generation.
Right.
And, actually what it amounts to is that as far as Germany is concerned, it's all right for someone else to produce the gas and the oil and all the rest of it. We will buy it and import it, but we won't do it ourselves because we're green, aren't we? So you can see this ridiculous situation.
Yeah, it's the same thing here.
Yeah.
It's the same politics playing out here under the Biden administration.
Exactly. And so, I mean, they have been, I think the phrase is, hoist by their own petard in that sense. It is a crazy situation. I mean, we have opened ourselves up to, an energy crisis, basically by doing away with fossil fuels without an adequate replacement. And whether there will ever be an adequate replacement, quite frankly, I doubt. But, we've got caught in this. And Putin has been actually quite clever exploiting this. Mm-hmm. What I didn't know until someone pointed it out to me is that Putin's PhD was in energy economics. Oh. Now, that's very interesting. He's got a better grasp of actually the economics of energy than any of the other world leaders, so far as I can see. And that informs us about what his objectives might be in doing this. And I think, if I was in his shoes, I would actually want to divorce my currency from the failings in the West, because one of the consequences of sanctions is that inflation in the form of rising prices is going to be far worse as a consequence. I mean, we've already talked about food, for example. We can talk about energy. I mean, if I tell you that I would not be surprised to see West Texas up at $200 a barrel, mm-hmm. You get some sort of feel for the inflation pressures, if you like, the price pressures coming through. At the same time, Shanghai is shut down, and there are huge logistical problems mounting over on that side of the world. So, this outlook for interest rates is extremely grim. So we already see what the Japanese are doing. They're mm-hmm. trying to stop yields rising because otherwise the central bank is bust with all this enormous portfolio of Japanese government bonds, corporate bonds, and equities that they've got on board. So they've drawn a line in the sand at 0.25% yield on the 10-year JGB. And what's happening? The currency is collapsing because it's a clear signal that where the preference is basically to keep bond yields down and to hell with the currency. And that's what's happening. And it's going to happen with the euro and the ECB because they've got exactly the same problem. They start mm-hmm. negative interest rates with roaring inflation. I mean, come on, this is just nonsense, complete nonsense.
All right. So what you see, though, Alasdair, is those currencies going down, the dollar getting stronger, and I'm hearing people on our media here talk about that. Look, the dollar is strong. Putin's economy is going to hell in a handbasket. But look at the dollar. The dollar's getting stronger through this, and they use that as a means to try to say, oh, we're okay. We're strong here in America.
Well, they're looking at completely the wrong thing. I mean, if you look at the foreign exchanges, you've got a collapsing yen and you've got a collapsing euro. Right. So, the dollar isn't going anywhere. It's the other things that are going down against it. And, if you think that you've got a strong dollar, just sort of think, well, what are commodity prices doing in dollars? I mean, that's a very, very different story. And that's actually where you should be looking.
Right, and then also, how's the dollar faring versus since Putin, demanded payment in rubles? How's the dollar doing relative to the Russian ruble and the Chinese currency, for example? I think both of them have gotten stronger recently.
Yes, they have. I mean, both of them have, and I would expect them to continue to be so. Because, from the point of view of buying natural gas and oil from Russia, there are not a huge amount of rubles in circulation in the West. So that is a thing which is going to continue, I think, to strengthen the ruble. I wouldn't be surprised to see the ruble go to somewhere less than 70 to the dollar. And we've already seen the Chinese have started stockpiling commodities and grains way back from as far back as March 2020, when the Fed reduced interest rates to zero and started 120 billion a month of QE. the Chinese knew what was happening on the money side, and so they didn't want to have a part of this. And the result is that they've accumulated quite a lot of things which are going to cost them more in dollars. Their currency has gone up by something like 11 or 12% since that March against the dollar. And, the ruble is in the same sort of camp. And really what they're doing is they're moving away from currencies which are dependent on financial assets as bank collateral to commodities as bank collateral. And this is a fundamental difference. We're all about to see a massive, massive stock market crash. I can say that with horrifying confidence because I can understand what's happening to interest rates. It's just that people in the equity market are sitting there hoping that it's still transient or something. I don't know what they're hoping on. I mean, they're on another planet, really. But the fact is that with price inflation running at where it is at the moment and where it is going to run as a result of sanctions, I mean, there is no way that you're going to see equities not fall. And we're talking about falling from a real bubble, too. I mean, a huge bubble. And this is the culmination of, 50 years from 1971 of the financialization of the dollar, sterling, the yen, and also the euro. And these financialized currencies are just going to be completely wiped out when you move, really by a huge, great bear market in both bonds and equities.
So you believe, Alasdair, that it's very, very likely that the Europeans, especially some of those more dependent on Russian oil and gas, are going to have to come up with rubles or gold or something to buy those assets. I mean, what are they going to do? Otherwise, freeze to death? Or can the United States come to the rescue? Or are there some other sources of energy they can get aside from bowing to the demands of Putin?
Well, I think this is Putin's point. I mean, he's saying to Germany et al., you can go and get your energy from whoever you want, but you're going to have to pay for it. And the energy input into the Eurozone is something like 40% of its total requirement from Russia. How do you replace that? I mean, President Biden has very kindly offered something like 10% of that 40% being shipped from America.
Yeah,
and that's about all he can do. I mean, it is not good. It really is not good.
You mentioned a PhD in economics for Putin in energy, and I heard an analyst, actually from a Canadian analyst who was a lender to the energy industry recently on an interview, talk about how the eastern part of the Ukraine is very, very rich in energy, in gas and oil, and that he believes that Putin has really seen the possibility of making Russia into an dominant energy player. It is already, but even more so with the Chinese, the Indians, and the Europeans. Those three markets, which would just absolutely be huge. You think this might be what he has in mind? Then it would seem as though that could be the case. And will India? I know that the Biden administration is trying to put some pressure on India, but what do you think?
It makes an awful lot of sense. I mean, it really does. Yes, I heard this thing about energy resources in eastern Ukraine, and I understand that that the resources are enormous, and I think that makes some sense of Putin's strategy. Basically, he wants to get the eastern Ukraine. Having tried to go for the lot and been rebuffed, he's definitely going to go for eastern Ukraine, capture that. He won't care who gets hurt in the way, who gets killed and all the rest of it. As far as he's concerned, I think what he wants is the real estate because of the oil under it. And there is no doubt. I mean, already Russia is the largest exporter of energy in the world. And talking about sanctions harming Russia. I mean, they've just declared the trade surplus for I think it was the month of February or something like that, hitting new records. Come on, wake up, America. This is not working. You're hurting yourselves at the end of the day. And I mean, we're just going along with it like lapdogs, which is crazy, absolutely crazy. I mean, nobody sees these dangers. So there we are.
Well, not very many do. You have been talking about them, David Stockman, on this show. There are some that do, but the vast majority, and the propaganda doesn't want to take us there. I think the idea is that we can keep printing money with the world's reserve currency. It's going to last forever. Alasdair, with just a few minutes left, 4 minutes, my engineer is telling me, talk to us about how this evolves into a gold standard globally, if you think that's possible.
Well, it's slightly more complex than that. I mean, if you look at the price of oil in gold, then I can tell you that from 1950, the price of oil measured in gold grams has actually fallen by 30%. Okay? Look at the chart of what's happened to the price of oil in dollars or sterling or whatever. I mean, it has not only been horrendously volatile, but it is also, I mean, the price has increased many multiples in those currencies. So it's not just oil, but this is true of most other commodities. So what we can say is that the way in which you get exposure to a commodity-driven currency and get out of a financial asset-driven currency is actually to buy gold, because gold is the proxy for for all those commodities. And I think that's the message that's really come through loud and clear from what's been happening recently. And as I talk, I see that gold is tending better. I mean, it's amazing how every evening in America they bash it in the paper market and bring it back. But I look at the last 5 days of trading, up, despite the fact that it's been bashed back every time. And currently it's trading at 1968, having been 1920. Now this is interesting, because at the same time, I see that Bitcoin has really come back, and Bitcoin is never going to be money. That's another story for another time, maybe. Yeah. But you can see really this situation is beginning to sort out the sheep from the goats.
So the best way to do if I know that you've mentioned Zoltan Pozsar, Credit Suisse analyst, who's talking about how he's actually talking about this being Bretton Woods 3. And how the world is going to go back to a commodity that I think he calls it outside money being commodity money, trumping inside money being this sort of fiat money that's created out of thin air. The idea that America has been able to live on this money that created out of thin air and use those dollars to buy up the world's goods, and Americans living beyond our means, it seems to me, Alasdair, one way or another, that can't go on forever, and that we may be getting very close to the end of the good times for Americans. I say that with trepidation as an American, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree with that entirely. And I think the thing to focus on is you're going to have far higher interest rates made worse because of this sanctions situation. That is going to crash markets. You do not want to be in currencies which are entirely dependent on financial assets as the collateral backing for the banking system. That, I'm afraid, describes the dollar, it describes sterling, it describes the yen, and it describes the euro. It does not describe the Chinese renminbi, and it does not describe the ruble. So that, I think, is the situation. The only way, we're not going to rush out and start buying rubles, and we're certainly not going to start rushing out and buying yuan. But what you can do is you can buy, in effect, a proxy for that situation, and that is what gold is. And I think anyone who doesn't have a little bit of gold is actually, being extremely bold.
Yeah. Or just drinking the Kool-Aid. Let's put it that way, perhaps. We'll have to leave it go at that, Alasdair. Thank you so much for your time. Always a pleasure having you, and we'll have to pick it up again sometime soon. Thank you so much.